I'm now going to invite our expert commentators, and I'm really sorry because we have some amazing people. Please, could you join me here? And your task is to reflect against what's been shared by the panel, and also to pose some challenges or issues to discuss at the tables. So, Dr. Sakho, the Country Director for UNAIDS in DRC, welcome. Mousumi Sarangi from ICCO in India, Program Manager. Rachel Carnegie, who all of you know, Co-Executive Director with the Anglican Alliance. Rabbi Idit from Israel, who works with the Rabbis for Human Rights. And Ayesha Chaudhry from the University of British Columbia, but a Department of Gender and Islamic Studies. Welcome, and Ayesha, we're going to start with you.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to try to stick with the 3-minute time limit that we have, which is interesting. And because we've been hearing about this stuff, I'm going to try not to repeat things. So basically, I want to make 2 important points that I think we should keep in mind when we're thinking about religion and development, especially with relation to Islam, so Islam and development. So the first point that I want to make is that we should expect more from religion. And we should expect more from religion in terms of what we think and what we are told its parameters are. So this means embracing multiplicity. And this, I mean, we've heard this again and again about whether religions need to speak out with a unified voice or whether we need to embrace the multiplicity. And I would argue that this is the nature of working with religion. We have to embrace that multiplicity. So what this means for Islam is that there is no one Islam. There is no Islamic perspective on any issue. Everything is contested. And it's important to keep that in mind, that everything is contested. And when we're working with different countries, of course, we have to take into account the political structure in terms of whether it's authoritarian or democratic, and the relationship that that political structure has to religion and to the clerical class. And we have to always remember under this heading that Muslims have many and varied theologies, which means that the clerical influence on Muslims is actually quite limited often. So if we look at the case of FGM just briefly, in the way that it was addressed in Gambia versus the way it was addressed in Egypt. In Gambia, religious leaders were able to influence reducing FGM considerably, but in Egypt, their influence was very limited. Another easy example for the limited influence of the clerical class is if we look at Egypt in the Arab Spring. So when Egyptians were in Tahrir Square trying to oust Mubarak, the Grand Mufti of Egypt at the time and Sheikh of Al-Azhar, Ali Guma, gave a fatwa, and he went on TV and he said, everybody go home. We're not going to be opposing the regime anymore. And nobody listened to him. I mean, Tahrir Square was still occupied, and Mubarak was eventually ousted. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. And often the clerical class in Muslim-majority countries ends up perpetuating racial and gender bias. So mostly Muslim men speak for Muslim women. And when we have gatherings, not only in the mosques, but when we have gatherings at the World Bank and other places, you often see it's Muslim men who are always representing Muslims, which is a perpetuation of that problem. Often Arab men speak for Muslims. There's a racial bias in that way, or white converts, because we can connect to them a little bit more easily. So we end up perpetuating the biases that already exist within the community. And just under expecting more from religion, to think briefly about CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Article 16 of CEDAW tries to give men and women equal rights in marriage. And the majority of countries that have objected to CEDAW are Muslim-majority countries. And the majority of those countries have cited Islamic law or Sharia as the reason for why they're doing that. So they're pitting 2 liberal values against each other, the value of religious pluralism and tolerance against the right to discriminate against women. So we're playing this very interesting game, and we need to be aware that Muslims across the board, hundreds of millions of Muslims actually do believe in gender equality, and that these governments that are using religious tolerance to support gender discrimination are not representative of Muslims and Muslim theologies. Okay, so the second point that I want to make is that we need to engage voices beyond the clerical class. So this is building on the first point. So the clerical class, as we just saw, often represents the status quo. It supports a patriarchal interpretation of Islam, which hinders development. And so what happens if we work within the system and don't engage voices beyond the clerical class is that we end up supporting injustice while we're meaning to actually promote justice. And so making a distinguishing between religion and religious establishment is important. And in this context, I would encourage you to think about religious feminism, and in particular, Muslim feminists and Islamic feminism, because Islamic feminists and Muslim feminists have overlapping interests with development and health providers. These are natural allies because they have taken the extra step to discuss gender equality in religious language and make an Islamic case for why Muslims should believe in gender equality and promote gender equality. And we know that gender equality reduces poverty, improves women's health, and I don't have to go into that. So given those basic points, I would say that one of the main challenges we face is not replicating structures of inequality when we are meaning to create equality. So trying to be cognizant of that and thinking about that racially in terms of gender and and economically and other issues. And my main recommendation, given my 2 points, would be to support and engage religious feminists and particularly Muslim feminist organizations when we're working for development. Thank you.
Thanks, Ayesha. Rabbi, Idit, you can speak from where you're sitting.
So I just wanted to say that I think the same thing that you said about Muslims are true about Judaism. So again, and promoting feminist Judaism inside the religion is a very important thing. And it doesn't matter, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to add is that you have groups who are less less egalitarian, but still there are feminists in them, so we need to find ways to promote it, although they wouldn't say that they would go the whole way to equality. The point that I wanted to make is that I think one of the distinctions we need to do is between culture and religion. And the example from, there was so many examples in the last two days that support that. In Israel, one of the issues that we encounter is the murder of women. And when people speak about murder of women, and when they speak about Muslims, then they would say, oh, that's because that's the religion. Mm-hmm. And when they would speak about murder of women with other kinds of groups, they wouldn't speak about the religion. But when you would go and speak to religious leaders, Muslim religious leaders, they would be against it. And they would say, this has nothing to do with our religion. So I think that one of the things we need to do as religious leaders is to speak out very loudly and make the distinction between what is inside our religion and what is not, and what is accepted as a religious act and what is not accepted. And I think it's very important because people who are usually not a religious leader will come and do something and say, oh, I did that because of my religion, but it's not. It's because of other issues and other things, and using the religion as an excuse just take us all backwards.
Thank you so much for that important distinction. Rachel.
Thank you. And I'd really like to build on that issue of women's leadership. And Archbishop Bernard mentioned about the Mothers' Union. And in our own church, we have 4 million around the world, and so who work on sexual violence as well as women's empowerment. So it is a huge opportunity to think about faith leadership in terms of men and women. I've been asked just to speak very briefly about the We Will Speak Out coalition, which is started as an ecumenical coalition, but is moving into faith globally and with chapters in various countries, including Burundi. And our job is really to share what research that we have, to promote more research, and to build best practice amongst ourselves. Looking at 4 key areas. The first is the role of faith leaders, and precisely as you say, Rabbi, about providing space, creating space where they can debate amongst themselves what is faith teaching, what is culture, and how to work constructively with that. And the second is about survivor voices and their voices in shaping policy and practice. And I want to particularly pick up on Lisa's point about what kind of evidence are we after, and who is the evidence for, and particularly to work with survivors on shaping and responding to that question. The third point is about the church as a safe space, the first-line responder, being able to link to health, legal, and other services, to create cultures of zero tolerance to sexual and gender-based violence. And then fourthly, as we heard eloquently from Archbishop Bernard about dealing with gender issues and transforming masculinities. So the 2 points I really wanted to make are these. The first is to recognise that we need a holistic response, and to pick up John Drew's challenge yesterday about analysing whether we're faith-based or secular, what is the role of religion in its various different shapes on this particular issue. So that if it is an opportunity, excellent. If it is a barrier, how do we work creatively and in an evidence-based way to turn the barrier into an opportunity? And the silence of churches and, for example, now being turned into an active voice is a critical example of flipping from one to the other. And the second is, I think, not just to look at faith-initiated responses to gender-based violence, but actually how, across the board, do we consider and factor in faith and faith-sensitive interventions along with cultural-sensitive interventions. And just to close, many will be familiar with the work of Tostan in Senegal, working on ending female genital cutting. And they obviously understood the misinterpretation of teachings, religious teachings, and encouraging and affirming this practice. And so what they did was brought scholars and created a space not to instrumentalize, but precisely so that religious leaders could work together to understand what were dynamics and the teachings of faith, and to clarify that with their communities. So that being part of what Lisa called a holistic community response. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
Okay. I'll share a bit about what we have been doing with the church in India. I represent Interchurch Cooperation for Development, a Dutch NGO, and we've been working with the National Council of Churches for the last 8 years on the topic of HIV. When we started on this journey in 2008, very interestingly, we thought, let us work with the church on how do we look at care and support vis-a-vis HIV. And we found there's a lot of work being done by the churches. What really needed to be done is how do we as faith communities look at stigma and discrimination, look at gender, and look at human sexuality, and how do we together as faith communities at the micro level make a difference. So then we, actually from an idea, we really engage with faith leaders and redesign the whole program on the 4 pillars of the church, the theological colleges, the hospitals, and the schools, of how do we look at these foci areas and look at how we can be more engaging with the community at large and part of the larger civil society, because the church doesn't transform in vacuum. We are part of society, and society is part of us. So how do we bring that togetherness in our whole approach? And we've journeyed these 8 years and interestingly covered many miles, specifically at the institutional level. Drawing up workplace policies which specifically address sexual and gender-based violence. But what still I feel a lot of ground needs to be covered is looking at our own male-dominated institutions. Do we, within our own faith communities, address it enough? Ensure that the women's voices are heard enough? Are there representations of women on boards in conferences and meetings when topics which are varied are discussed, not only something as counseling or skill building or, say, a small empowerment program? Are we inclusive enough? So if we say we are the called community today, are we leading the process and being inclusive enough for the communities and also involving, say, interfaith in that whole process? Because as faith communities, we are not exclusive. We are inclusive. And how do we bring in that synergy together? I see my time getting close, so I'll leave with 3 thoughts for the group to discuss. Is as faith communities, do we only offer prayer as a method to address sexual and gender-based violence? Do we look at faithfulness of women as a tool to continue to take violence in our day-to-day work? And third, men are not born violent. Are we engaging enough with them? Engaging enough with them to create new models of masculinity, which builds on respect for women and totally dejects gender-based violence? Thank you.
Thanks, Mousumi. Dr. Sakho.
Many thanks. Let me thank my colleague Veena, who is here and who's invited me. As institutions and our perspective at country level as UNS representative and dealing with sexual gender-based violence is linked to what is exactly the reality. I'm working in DRC since 3 years as a UNS representative, and I'm a Muslim. I'm from Senegal, and I spent 20 years in UN. And when I travel a lot of in DRC, I look at that this country is specific in terms of conflict and post-conflict, as you know, but basically in terms of sexual-based violence. It shows that out of violence or conflict, we can say that sexual gender-based violence are in many provincial areas, not only in the area where we have the conflict. That's why in East, basically in Kivu, Goma, and Bukavu, basically in this area, the relevant, the activities of sexual gender violence are very high. That's why the prevalence of HIV also is very, very important in this zone. Basically, at the least, we have from 1.5 to 5% of prevalence of HIV. In this context, if you have these conflict situations and this violence against women and men also, because it seems that there are some cases of violence or rape from men. And that's why the evolution of HIV is very important in this country, basically when we talk about Goma in DRC. It's very important. I get opportunities as UNS to work with faith-based organizations in terms of training, dealing, look at exactly what happened at grassroots level and what can be done. I'm sure that the domain is very, it's a wide domain because we take only account the sexual gender-based violence. But if we take the definition of what we call it by violence against women or sexuality, it's very hard. That's why we try to focus on this domain. And we had a good relationship with faith-based organization, basically with Tearfund and Anglican Church and Catholics and Muslims, and try to see what are exactly the key messages, how to deal with those who are victims and how to work with the government side, because there are laws, there are force, negative, small group inside the country, the official force, FRDC, we have the other groups, and each groups need to talk in a conflict situation. You mean that the situation is very not easy. You have to talk with rebels or other groups, you have to talk with the governments, and you see that the problem is very important. Linked to HIV, we try to give them norm and regulation. What UNS is thinking, to give ARV for all people who need absolutely and get HIV. We try also to give them what we are calling PEP kit. If you are exposed to have this sexual violence, you need PEP kit. So women who are victims of this violence need to get PEP kit. And the PEP kits are absolutely not very available everywhere. We need also to train, to talk, to key message, to train for trainers. That's why the programmatic area, there are a lot of challenges which we try to look at, basically in terms of those who are doing this job in terms of financing, equipment, logistics, human rights. Basically, the violation of human rights also is in this same package. When I look at also what religions are doing in this country, as you say, 15% of health officers or health facilities are managed by faith-based organization. As evidence of impact, I will absolutely conclude that the number of people who get HIV are very increasing in the country, and it's part of the government, the public office, and also for FBOs, because there are a lot of health facilities, laboratory equipment, and staff where we have these FBOs. That's why, for me, faith-based organizations are a lot of evidence in terms of impact for those who are victims. If you give them counseling, social support, if you listen to them, it's a very big step. And these activities are mainly made in this country with faith-based organizations. The last thing I would like to raise is only the important relationship between UNAIDS and the faith-based organization, call it a memorandum of a framework of work. What are we things to do? We have to have the people at the centrality of our action. We have to give them what they need. They need IRV. They need ABCD, absolutely, to be very clear, prevention against HIV and AIDS. They need also social support, psychology support. They need what we are calling a comprehensive framework in our system called fast track. We have to do this kind of job at the moment. We don't have to delay it. We cannot wait. That's why we said we have to do that right now, at the right thing in the right place. UNS try to see what we are calling these windows of fast track between 2015 and 2010. If you don't push relief for people who are victims of violence, if you don't push those who are at risk populate to get HIV, because the HIV is not over. As you know, we don't have the vaccine, when we don't have a real cure, we have to push a little bit until 2030, maybe, to get the vaccine and to get absolutely the right cure. At right time, the IRV is not absolutely what we need. The research are ongoing. That's why we need to fast track and to do that now. That means we have to go with the community to deal with them and to look at the financial issues. I listen every time, 2 days, these financial issues. We need to maintain, to sustain these financial issues. We need also to look at what we are calling the global plan. It's not correct, not ethical to have transmission from mother to child. We have to stop it, and it's possible to stop this transmission in Africa. It's very important that at this time being, everywhere there is no transmission from mother to child, but at the time being, there are a lot of transmission from mother to child in Africa. We need also to get what we are calling the 9-9 strategies. You listen well, UNS said we have to give the test for all people who need to get. What we are calling 9% of people have to get the test. If they get the test and we try to give them IRV at 9%, we will stop the epidemic at around 2030. This initiative, called it 99, is very important for the community, for international community, to look at that. We cannot have the development, sustainable development goal without ending HIV/AIDS. That's why I once again thank all these faith-based organizations and try to go with you at country level, at operational, where we are dealing without any considerations. Because, you know, these faith-based organizations are very sensitive in terms of belief, what we believe, how to do that, what we define as SGBV or MSM or so on. That's why we need absolutely your engagement, because you are at the front line, you are at the communities level, and your voice are very important. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sakho. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. We are rushing as usual. So please could all of you and the panel speakers join each of the groups so that you can carry your point, what you've raised, into further discussion. I think let's try and keep the main thing and focus on recommendations, because we want to leave this place knowing what we can do immediately and what we can do and keep as a priority for action. Thank you very much. One of the things I'd love to say is, in my work as part of Tearfund and working across 8 countries with over 457 survivors to date, the desire for evidence about what works and how we can end this, actually they carry that desire as much as we do. And therefore, I think it's a real challenge to us about how we put them at the heart of it, and to understand what are they looking for. That means life is better, the world is safer, their local communities are safer, and that their local faith space is a compassionate space. I think that is a priority across the board. They want it, we want it, and everyone else in between wants it as well. So it'll be, as the GBV hub within the JLI community, that's why I'm involved, because we really want to know what works. We really want to know what can end this, and how do we prevent it and put our best efforts there. So we are committed. The scoping study, the draft that Lisa shared, will conclude in the next couple of months. In September, at the Sexual Violence Research Initiative Conference in Cape Town, we are hoping that there will be a roundtable of policymakers who will look at this report and who will really engage at a policy level about how do we take these recommendations, how do we translate them into meaningful action so that we don't come back and raise the same issues again. That is our commitment as a hub. And if anyone is not part of the hub here, you're most welcome to join. You'll find us on the JLI website. We'd love to have you. We'd love to have your wisdom and engagement. And also to say, as a hub, we're really keen to pilot this seeking of evidence from different perspectives, picking up where John drew his presentation about the tree and how we go about it. We'd love to work on that and pilot that because we want it. Thanks very much for your input and your engagement. I think now we have a 15-minute break, and then we come back into this place by 11:30 and in the same groups. Thank you.